It was a lazy Tuesday afternoon at a nearly deserted gas station on the outskirts of a small, dusty town. The sun hung high in the sky, blazing with an intensity that made the cracked pavement shimmer like a mirage. The air was heavy, thick with heat and the faint smell of gasoline. Cicadas droned in the distance, their relentless buzz adding a soundtrack to the oppressive stillness. Frank Mitchell stood by his weathered pickup truck, a battered relic from another era, leaning casually against its faded blue frame. The truck, like Frank, had clearly seen better days. Its paint was chipped, and the passenger door bore the unmistakable dent of some long-forgotten accident. Frank didn't seem to mind its imperfections, he had his own. At first glance, Frank appeared unremarkable, a wiry man in his late 50s, his lean frame draped in a plain flannel shirt and jeans that had seen more years than some of the gas station's customers. His boots, scuffed and worn, suggested he'd walked many miles, and his face, lined and leathery, told stories of days spent under the sun and nights without rest. A ball cap shaded his eyes, though not enough to hide the sharpness in them. To the casual observer, he could have been anyone, a retired rancher, a wanderer passing through, or perhaps just another tired soul with no particular place to be. But if you looked closely, really looked, you'd notice the little things. The way Frank's eyes, sharp and calculating, never stopped scanning the lot. The way his hand, resting on the truck's side, seemed ready to move at a moment's notice. Even his posture, as casual as it seemed, hinted at a coiled energy, as though he was always prepared for something. Frank took a slow sip from a bottle of water, the condensation dripping down onto the dusty ground. It was a small action, unhurried and deliberate, but it gave him time to observe. The gas station was quiet, almost eerily so. The clerk, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, was hunched behind the counter inside, lazily scrolling on his phone. A lone car pulled out of the station, kicking up a small cloud of dust as it disappeared down the empty road. Frank liked it this way, quiet and uneventful. After all, he hadn't come here looking for excitement. He'd had enough of that in his life. Long years in the service had taught him to appreciate the slower moments, the mundane stretches where nothing happened, and no one needed him to step in. Retirement, as far as he was concerned, wasn't a reward but a necessity. He'd earned the right to fade into the background, to be the kind of person no one noticed. But Frank's past wasn't the kind you could just leave behind. It clung to him like a shadow, unseen but always there, shaping the way he moved, the way he thought. He didn't talk about it, not to strangers, not to anyone. The gas station clerk didn't ask, the bikers pulling into the lot wouldn't care. The rumble of motorcycles broke the stillness, their engines roaring like thunder as they approached. Frank's eyes flicked toward the sound. 6 bikes, sleek and menacing, rolled into the station in formation. Their riders wore leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols, each one a badge of rebellion and a warning to outsiders. These weren't casual bikers out for a joyride. They were a gang, and their presence carried an unspoken tension, a promise of trouble. The lead biker, a towering man with a thick, graying beard and mirrored sunglasses, pulled up to the pump nearest the station. He killed the engine, the silence it left behind somehow louder than the noise it replaced. The others followed suit, dismounting their bikes with practiced ease. Frank watched them from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't react, but his body shifted ever so slightly, a subtle change in posture that only someone trained to notice such things would catch. He took another sip of water, his gaze returning to the horizon as if the bikers weren't even there. Inside the station, the young clerk looked up, his face pale as he took in the group of men now dominating the lot. One of the bikers strode toward the building, pushing open the glass door with enough force to make the bell above it jangle violently. The clerk straightened, clearly trying to look composed, but his hands shook as he set down his phone. Frank's attention remained on the lot, though his ears were tuned to the sounds inside. He caught snippets of the exchange, the biker's voice, low and rough, demanding something, and the clerk's nervous stammers in response. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The other bikers lingered near their bikes, lighting cigarettes and talking among themselves. Their laughter was loud and harsh, a sharp contrast to the quiet that had settled over the station just moments before. One of them glanced in Frank's direction, nudging his companion and saying something that made the others chuckle. Frank didn't acknowledge them. He'd been in situations like this before, and he knew better than to make the first move. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how much he tried to avoid it. The lead biker emerged from the station, a pack of cigarettes in hand and a sneer on his face. He joined the others, his eyes scanning the lot until they landed on Frank. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Nice truck you got there. Bet it's as slow as you." Frank didn't respond. He twisted the cap back onto his water bottle, his movements deliberate. "Ah, come on," another biker chimed in, stepping closer. "You hard of hearing, or just too scared to answer?" Frank finally turned to face them, his expression calm but firm. His eyes met the lead biker's, and for a brief moment, neither man spoke. It was a quiet standoff, a battle of wills that no one else in the lot seemed to notice. "I hear just fine," Frank said at last, his voice steady. "But if you're looking for trouble, you're barking up the wrong tree." The bikers laughed, a chorus of derision that echoed across the empty lot. The lead biker took a step forward, his sneer widening into a grin. "Oh, is that so?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What are you gonna do, old man?" Frank didn't answer right away. He simply stared at them, his gaze unflinching. To the bikers, it might have looked like defiance. To Frank, it was something else entirely, a calculation, an assessment of every variable in the situation. He had no intention of starting anything. But if these men insisted on pushing, they'd find out soon enough that Frank Mitchell wasn't just some retired drifter with a beat-up truck. The lead biker took another step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. His companions lingered behind him, watching the scene unfold with smirks and chuckles. They clearly didn't think much of Frank, just an old man standing in their way, someone to amuse themselves with before moving on to their next destination. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," the biker said, tilting his head as he studied Frank. His grin revealed a mouthful of teeth, several of them gold. "But guts only get you so far, old man." Frank let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking between the bikers and their surroundings. He wasn't worried, not yet, but he knew the signs. Men like these didn't just stop at taunts. They thrived on fear, on the satisfaction of pushing others around. If he didn't de-escalate, or, worse, if they decided to escalate, this quiet afternoon could turn into something far less pleasant. "You've had your fun," Frank said, his voice steady but low enough to carry just the faintest edge of warning. "Why don't you boys fill up your tanks and move along?" The lead biker raised his eyebrows, then let out a bark of laughter. "Hear that?" he said, glancing over his shoulder at his crew. "He's giving us orders now. Thinks he's in charge." The others laughed along with him, their jeers filling the quiet lot. Frank didn't react. He'd seen this kind of behavior more times than he cared to count. Bullies, no matter what shape or size, all had the same patterns: laugh, mock, provoke, and, if that didn't work, escalate to intimidation. Frank had dealt with far more dangerous people in his time, men with real power, real training, and far less predictable natures. But these bikers didn't know that. To them, Frank was just a weathered man with a worn truck and no fight left in him. The leader turned back to Frank, his grin widening. "You think you can tell us what to do, huh? Let me guess, you're one of those retired types. Spent your life driving a desk, huh? Pushing papers." Frank tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. "Something like that," he said, the barest hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The leader stepped closer, now just a couple of feet away. The heat of the day seemed to thicken the air between them. He was taller than Frank by several inches, with broad shoulders and arms inked with tattoos of skulls, flames, and other menacing symbols. His leather vest bore a patch that read Serpents MC across the back. "Well, Mr. Desk Jockey," the leader said, leaning in slightly. "Why don't you step aside and let the real men handle their business? Or maybe you'd like to hand over those keys. Looks like your truck's got more life in it than you do." Frank's eyes narrowed just slightly, a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. His grip on the truck's side tightened, though his stance remained relaxed. "You want my truck," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. "You'll have to take it from me." The leader's grin faltered for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of confusion, or was it hesitation? Frank didn't give him time to think. He stepped away from the truck, standing tall as he faced the man head-on. "I've seen your type before," Frank said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that cut through the biker's laughter. "You think you're tough because you ride in a pack. But let me tell you something, tough isn't about how loud you are or how many friends you've got backing you up. Tough is what you do when you're alone." The lot fell silent, the bikers exchanging glances as the leader's grin disappeared entirely. Frank held his ground, his gaze unwavering. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a single threatening move, but there was something in his tone, in his presence, that made even the most arrogant among them pause. The leader scoffed, shaking his head as if to brush off the unease creeping into his chest. "You talk big for an old man," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had moments before. "But words don't mean much around here." Frank nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice dropping just slightly. "Words don't mean much. Actions do." Without warning, one of the younger bikers, barely out of his 20s, with a shaved head and a cocky smirk, stepped forward, emboldened by the tension. "Why don't we show this guy what happens when you mouth off to the serpents?" he said, cracking his knuckles. "Not yet," the leader said, raising a hand to stop him. His gaze stayed locked on Frank, studying him more closely now. There was something about this old man, something he couldn't quite place. He should have looked frail, helpless, but he didn't. Instead, Frank stood there like a man who'd faced storms far worse than this one. Inside the gas station, the young clerk peered through the window, his face pale as he watched the confrontation. He didn't know what to do. Call the police? Hide? The bikers weren't the kind of trouble anyone wanted to deal with, but this stranger, there was something about him. The tension in the lot stretched like a taut wire, every second feeling longer than the last. Frank didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move. He was waiting. Waiting for them to make the first mistake. Finally, the leader stepped back, gesturing for his crew to stand down. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today, old man," he said, though his words rang hollow. "Let's get out of here, boys." The younger biker looked disappointed but followed orders, muttering under his breath as he climbed back onto his bike. The others did the same, revving their engines as they prepared to leave. Frank didn't move until the last bike had pulled away, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. Only then did he relax, his shoulders dropping slightly as he let out a quiet sigh. The clerk stepped outside, his hands trembling as he approached. "Sir. I thought they were going to," he trailed off, unable to find the words. Frank gave him a small, reassuring smile. "They didn't," he said simply, unscrewing the cap on his water bottle and taking another sip. "But how did you? Why didn't they?" Frank glanced toward the horizon, his gaze distant. "Sometimes, it's not about what you do," he said. "It's about what you don't do. People like that, they rely on fear. Take that away, and they've got nothing. The clerk stared at him, trying to make sense of the man standing before him. Frank didn't offer any more explanations. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off without another word, leaving the clerk to wonder just who he'd been talking to. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the midday stillness, a symphony of growling engines that sent a ripple through the quiet air. One by one, 6 sleek machines roared into the lot, their riders adorned in leather jackets, tattoos, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing they're feared. These men didn't just ride bikes, they wore their dominance like armor. Each jacket bore the same insignia on the back, a coiled serpent surrounded by flames, with the word Serpents MC scrawled in bold lettering. They moved with the swagger of men who had nothing to lose and the power to take whatever they wanted. The group spread out across the lot, claiming the space as their own. Their laughter was loud, jagged, and full of menace, cutting through the silence like broken glass. They weren't here for gas or snacks. They were here to remind everyone who ruled the roads in these parts. The leader, a towering man with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and a beard like steel wool, dismounted his bike with an air of authority. His mirrored sunglasses caught the sunlight, making it impossible to see where his gaze landed. He took a moment to survey the lot before striding purposefully toward the gas station entrance. Inside, the young clerk froze as the biker pushed through the door, the bell above it jingling in protest. The leader's boots clunked heavily against the tiled floor, and with a sudden movement, he slammed his fist onto the counter. The clerk jumped, his wide eyes darting between the biker's face and the cash register. "Cigarettes," the man barked, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of command. "Now." The clerk fumbled with trembling hands, grabbing a pack from the display behind him. He moved too slowly for the biker's liking. "Faster, kid," the man snapped, leaning forward and narrowing his eyes. The tension inside was thick enough to choke on. Outside, Frank Mitchell had been leaning against his truck, quietly observing. His outward demeanor hadn't changed, but his sharp eyes caught every detail. He could see the clerk's fear even through the gas station's glass door. He could read the body language of the other bikers, casual, but not without purpose. Frank wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. It didn't take long for the bikers' attention to shift. One of them, a wiry man with a wild grin and a mohawk that stood tall against the wind, nudged his friend and pointed toward Frank. "Hey, old-timer," the man called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nice truck you got there. Bet it's as slow as you." The others chuckled, their laughter a low rumble that rolled through the lot. Frank didn't respond. He remained leaning against his truck, twisting the cap back onto his water bottle with deliberate slowness. "Oh, look at him," another biker chimed in, his tone sneering. "All quiet and serious. What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to answer?" The laughter grew louder, emboldened by their own taunts. The leader stepped back outside, lighting a cigarette as he joined his crew. His eyes flicked to Frank, and a smirk curved his lips. "What's the story here?" the leader asked, taking a long drag before exhaling a plume of smoke. "We bothering you, old man?" Frank finally turned to face them, his expression calm but unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of his silence hang in the air. Then, with a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, he spoke. "I hear just fine," he said, his voice low but firm. "But if you boys are looking for trouble, I'm not the one you want to mess with." The leader let out a bark of laughter, harsh and sharp, as if Frank's words were the funniest thing he'd heard all day. "Oh, is that so?" he said, stepping closer. "And what are you gonna do, old man? Show us your war stories? Lecture us about the good old days?" Frank didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze with a level stare, his calmness a stark contrast to the biker's brashness. "No lectures," he said simply. Just advice. Walk away while you still can. The group howled with laughter, their voices echoing across the lot. The leader shook his head, his grin widening as he took another step toward Frank. "You've got guts," he said, his tone both mocking and impressed. "But guts don't count for much when you're outnumbered. You sure you're ready to take on the serpents?" Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his eyes scan the group, taking in every detail: the way they stood, the way they held themselves, the subtle shifts in their posture. It was instinct, honed from years of experience. "I've faced worse," he said finally, his tone so calm it was almost unnerving. The leader's grin faltered, just for a second, but it was enough for Frank to notice. The moment passed quickly, replaced by a scowl. The leader's pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. "You've got a smart mouth for an old man," he said, stepping even closer until he was just a few feet away. "Maybe we ought to teach you some respect." One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down the side of his face, cracked his knuckles. "Yeah, let's show him what happens when you mess with the serpents," he said, his voice eager and full of malice. "Not yet," the leader said, holding up a hand to stop him. His eyes were locked on Frank, studying him more closely now. There was something about this man, something that didn't quite add up. He didn't look scared. He didn't look angry. He just looked ready. The leader tilted his head, his smirk returning as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You've got some nerve," he said, his tone light but with an edge. "I'll give you that. But nerve only gets you so far." Frank didn't move, didn't speak. His silence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the noise and bravado of the bikers. The tension in the air was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. Inside the gas station, the clerk watched from behind the counter, his face pale as he peered through the glass. He didn't know who the stranger was, but he couldn't look away. The bikers didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't see. Frank wasn't just an old man with a worn truck and a quiet demeanor. He was a storm waiting to break, and they were about to find out just how wrong they'd been. The leader took a step back, flicking his cigarette to the ground and grinding it under his boot. He wasn't laughing anymore, but the smirk remained a thin veneer of confidence he wore like a mask. "You've got a big mouth, old man. But let me tell you something about the serpents. We don't walk away. Especially not when someone thinks they can talk down to us." Frank tilted his head, his gaze steady. "You're right," he said. "You don't walk away. But maybe today's the day you start." The younger bikers exchanged incredulous looks, their disbelief quickly morphing into anger. The wiry one with the scar took another step forward, his fists clenched. "Let me handle this," he growled, his voice full of pent-up aggression. "Hold on," the leader said, raising a hand to stop him. His eyes never left Frank. "The old man wants to play tough? Let him. But first, I want to know something." The leader crossed his arms, his posture exuding mock curiosity. "You're standing there like you're not afraid of us. Like you think you've got the upper hand. So tell me, what makes you so special? You some kind of ex-cop? A war vet?" Frank's smirk deepened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back against his truck, his relaxed posture a deliberate contrast to the growing tension. "Don't like questions, huh?" the leader said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "That's fine. We don't need to talk to get our point across." The wiry biker took his leader's words as a green light and lunged forward, aiming to grab Frank by the collar. It happened faster than the others expected, but not fast enough for Frank. In one fluid motion, Frank sidestepped the attack, his hand shooting out to grip the younger man's wrist. The movement was controlled, precise, and executed with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. The biker yelped as Frank twisted his arm, forcing him to his knees. It wasn't a display of brute strength, it was pure technique, the kind that left no room for resistance. Frank held him there for a moment, his expression calm but unyielding. "First mistake," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Don't make another one." He released the man's arm and stepped back, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The wiry biker scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist and glaring at Frank with a mix of pain and humiliation. The other bikers stared in stunned silence. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of cicadas and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The leader's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a scowl. He took a step forward, his voice low and threatening. "You've got some moves, old man. But don't think that makes you untouchable." Frank met his glare with a steady gaze. "It's not about being untouchable," he said. "It's about knowing when to pick a fight. And trust me, you don't want to pick this one." The leader hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was weighing his options, trying to decide whether to back down or double down. His pride demanded action, but something about Frank's calm demeanor gave him pause. Inside the gas station, the young clerk watched with wide eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who this man was or how he'd managed to hold his own against the serpents, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The standoff continued, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the leader sneered and gestured to his crew. "Get on your bikes," he snapped. "We've wasted enough time here." The younger bikers hesitated, their egos bruised and their anger simmering just below the surface. But one by one, they obeyed, climbing onto their motorcycles and revving the engines. As the leader turned to leave, he pointed a finger at Frank, his eyes narrowing into slits. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and full of venom. "We'll be seeing you again." Frank didn't flinch. He simply watched as the bikes roared to life and peeled out of the lot, leaving a trail of dust and tension in their wake. For a moment, silence returned to the gas station. The air felt heavy, charged with the lingering echoes of the confrontation. Frank took a slow breath, his gaze following the distant trail of the bikers until they disappeared from view. The gas station clerk finally stepped outside, his hands trembling as he approached Frank. "Sir," he stammered, his voice shaky. "I thought they were going to." "They didn't," Frank interrupted, his tone calm and reassuring. The clerk stared at him, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to ask. "Who are you?" he finally managed. Frank gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Just a guy passing through," he said simply. Without another word, Frank climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off down the highway, leaving the clerk standing in the lot, his thoughts a whirlwind of curiosity and awe. The air grew thick with tension as the bikers exchanged uncertain glances. The bravado that had fueled their taunts moments ago faltered in the face of Frank's sudden, efficient takedown. His movements were too precise, too practiced. The man they had mocked as an old-timer was now standing in front of them, calm and composed, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Retired Special Forces," Frank repeated, his voice low and even. "Now, I suggest you all think very carefully about your next move." The biker on his knees, clutching his wrist, grimaced in pain but still managed a defiant glare. "Special Forces, huh? That's supposed to scare us?" Frank tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "It's not about scaring you," he said. "It's about letting you know exactly what you're up against. So, unless you want this to get a whole lot worse, I recommend you walk away." But the serpents weren't known for backing down, not even when the odds shifted against them. The leader, who had been hanging back, stepped forward now, his face dark with anger and determination. He wasn't about to let an outsider humiliate his crew without reasserting control. You think you can just walk all over us because you've got some fancy moves, the leader sneered. You've got no idea who you're messing with, old man. Frank didn't reply. Instead, he bent down, picked up the water bottle he had placed on the truck bed, and twisted the cap off with deliberate calm. Taking a slow sip, he set it back down, his lack of urgency sending a clear message, I'm in no rush, but you're running out of time. The leader's patience snapped. Get him, he barked, and the remaining bikers surged forward, their faces contorted with anger and determination. What followed could only be described as a controlled storm. Frank didn't move like a man in his 50s, he moved like someone half his age, each step measured, each action precise. He sidestepped the first attacker, his foot sweeping out to trip the man and send him sprawling to the ground. Another lunged with a wild swing, but Frank ducked beneath it and delivered a sharp elbow to the man's ribs, forcing a grunt of pain as he staggered back. The fight wasn't chaotic, it was clinical. For every move the bikers made, Frank had a counter, each more effective than the last. He didn't just overpower them, he dismantled them, using their own momentum and lack of discipline against them. By the time the dust settled, 3 more bikers were on the ground, groaning and clutching at their bruised or twisted limbs. The leader and the last remaining member of his crew stood frozen, their confidence now replaced with uncertainty and, for the first time, a hint of fear. The leader's jaw tightened as he weighed his options. He wasn't stupid, he could see that Frank wasn't an ordinary man. But his pride wouldn't let him back down without at least one more attempt to save face. You're good, he admitted grudgingly, his voice steady but lacking its earlier bravado. I'll give you that. But no one humiliates the serpents and gets away with it. Frank raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. Humiliation isn't my goal, he said. Teaching a lesson, maybe. But you're making it real hard to let this end quietly. The leader glanced at his remaining man and nodded. Together, they began circling Frank, their movements careful now, more deliberate. They had learned enough to know they couldn't rush him, but they still believed they could overwhelm him with numbers and persistence. Frank watched them closely, his eyes flicking between the two as they tried to position themselves for an advantage. His hands, loose at his sides, twitched slightly, ready to act the moment they made their move. The younger biker lunged first, aiming low in an attempt to tackle Frank. But Frank anticipated the move, stepping aside and bringing his knee up sharply into the man's stomach. The biker crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, leaving only the leader standing. For a moment, the leader hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching as he stared at Frank. His crew lay scattered around him, and it was clear he had underestimated his opponent. But backing down now, in front of his men, felt like an impossibility. You think you've won, the leader growled, his voice low and dangerous. This ain't over. Not by a long shot. Frank took a step closer, his expression unreadable. It's over when you decide it is, he said. Walk away now, and no one else gets hurt. But if you keep pushing, I promise you won't like where this ends. The leader glared at him, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation. Finally, he spat on the ground and raised his hands in mock surrender. Fine, he said, his tone full of venom. You win today. But you'd better watch your back, old man. The serpents don't forget. Frank watched silently as the leader helped his groaning crew back to their feet. One by one, they staggered to their bikes, casting glances of resentment and confusion in Frank's direction. The leader was the last to mount his motorcycle, his expression twisted into a scowl as he revved the engine. We'll be seeing you again, he said, his voice carrying over the growl of the bike. Frank didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching as the serpents roared out of the gas station lot, their bruised pride trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. As the noise of the motorcycles faded into the distance, silence returned to the lot. Frank exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension that had built during the confrontation. He walked over to his truck, picked up his water bottle, and took another sip. The gas station clerk, who had been peeking from behind the counter the entire time, finally mustered the courage to step outside. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Sir," the clerk began, his voice shaky. What just happened? Who are you?" Frank glanced at him, his expression calm but with a hint of weariness. "Just a guy trying to mind his own business," he said simply. The clerk stared at him, clearly unsatisfied with the answer but too intimidated to press further. "Well, thank you," he said awkwardly. Frank nodded, climbing into his truck and starting the engine. As he pulled out of the lot, his thoughts were already elsewhere. The serpents wouldn't let this go, he knew that much. They were prideful, reckless, and dangerous. But Frank wasn't worried. He'd dealt with worse before, and he'd deal with them again if he had to. For now, though, he just wanted to get back on the road, away from the noise, the chaos, and the reminders of a life he had hoped to leave behind. The road stretched ahead, long and lonely, lined by dry fields and the occasional gas station sign faded by years of sun and neglect. Frank kept his grip steady on the steering wheel, his thoughts wandering as the miles rolled beneath his tires. The encounter with the serpents was already fading into the background, but not because it didn't matter. It was just familiar. Bullies are all the same, he thought. Different uniforms, different methods, but always the same arrogance, the same delusion that they were invincible. But the serpents had underestimated him, just as so many had before. He sighed, adjusting his rearview mirror. In the distance, a faint cloud of dust was rising on the horizon. Frank's eyes narrowed, the lines on his face deepening as he squinted into the shimmering heat waves. It wasn't long before the sound reached him, the faint but unmistakable rumble of motorcycles. The gas station clerk stood at the counter, staring out at the empty lot. He replayed the scene in his mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. The man who had just left Frank was unlike anyone he'd ever met. The way he moved, the calm in his voice, the precision of his actions, it was almost unreal. "Who is he?" the clerk muttered to himself, shaking his head. He didn't have long to ponder. The distant sound of engines grew louder, and moments later, a different set of motorcycles roared into the lot. These weren't the serpents. The bikes were sleek, polished to a shine, and the riders wore matching jackets with a logo the clerk didn't recognize. A tall, lean man dismounted first, pulling off his helmet to reveal a head of graying hair and sharp, piercing eyes. He walked into the station with an air of authority, glancing around before stepping up to the counter. "Afternoon," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "I'm looking for a man. Late 50s, lean build, driving a pickup truck. Might have passed through here recently." The clerk blinked, his throat suddenly dry. Yeah," he said, nodding quickly. "He was just here. Left not too long ago." "Why? Is everything okay?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze hardening slightly. "That depends," he said. "Which way did he go?" The clerk pointed toward the highway, unsure of what else to do. "He headed west," he said. "Thanks," the man replied, slipping a bill onto the counter before turning on his heel and walking out. The clerk watched as the riders mounted their bikes and sped off in the direction Frank had gone, their engines roaring like thunder. Frank spotted the cloud of dust behind him growing larger. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, then checked his fuel gauge. He wasn't too worried, his truck had seen worse, and so had he. But something about the persistence of the noise behind him made him uneasy. Pulling over at the next rest stop, he parked in the shade of an old oak tree and got out to stretch his legs. The area was quiet, just a couple of families picnicking at tables and a lone RV parked at the far end of the lot. He leaned against the truck, his eyes scanning the horizon. He wasn't paranoid, just cautious. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that trouble wasn't far off. Sure enough, the sound of engines grew louder, and within minutes, a group of motorcycles pulled into the rest stop. But these weren't the Serpents. These bikes were cleaner, their riders more disciplined. Frank straightened, his muscles tensing ever so slightly as the men dismounted and began approaching. The leader, the same sharp-eyed man who had questioned the clerk, stepped forward. He didn't look like a biker, at least not the reckless kind Frank had dealt with earlier. There was something professional about him, something deliberate. "Frank Mitchell," the man said, stopping a few feet away. It wasn't a question. Frank didn't react, his expression unreadable. "Depends on who's asking," he said finally. The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Call me Garrett," he said. "We've got some unfinished business, you and me." Frank's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "I don't know you," he said. "And if you're smart, you'll keep it that way." Garrett chuckled, a dry sound that carried no humor. "Oh, you know me, Frank. Maybe not by name, but you know the type. I'm here because someone paid me to find you. And judging by the mess you left at that gas station, I'd say you're still as good as they say." Frank's eyes narrowed, his stance shifting subtly. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Turn around and walk away." Garrett shook his head, his smile fading. "Can't do that," he said. "But I'll give you a choice. Come with us now, nice and easy, or we do this the hard way." Frank didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Garrett at the other riders, assessing their positions, their postures, their level of readiness. His mind worked quickly, calculating angles and options, weighing the risks. Finally, he spoke. "You might want to call your employer," he said. "Tell them the deal's off." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "And why would I do that?" Frank stepped forward, his voice steady and cold. "Because the last guy who thought he could control me didn't live to regret it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Garrett's expression hardened, and he gestured sharply to his men. "Take him," he ordered. The riders moved as one, but Frank was already ahead of them. He grabbed the water bottle from his truck bed, twisting off the cap and flinging the contents in a wide arc. The liquid splashed across the pavement, creating a brief but effective distraction as the men hesitated. In that split second, Frank moved. He swung the bottle like a club, catching the nearest man across the jaw and sending him sprawling. Pivoting on his heel, he grabbed another by the arm and twisted, disarming him with a quick, practiced motion. The fight was fast, brutal, and efficient. Frank didn't rely on strength alone, he used leverage, timing, and the environment to his advantage. Within minutes, half of Garrett's crew was incapacitated, and the rest were retreating, unsure of how to handle the relentless force they had underestimated. Garrett watched, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected him. When it was over, Frank stood in the middle of the lot, breathing evenly, his gaze locked on Garrett. "Tell whoever sent you," he said, his voice low and firm, "to leave me alone. This is their only warning." Garrett didn't reply. He simply nodded, a reluctant acknowledgement of defeat, and signaled to his remaining men to retreat. As they rode off, Frank turned back to his truck, his face unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end. It never was. But for now, at least, he could keep moving. The bikers stumbled toward their motorcycles, their confidence shattered, their loud laughter and bold taunts replaced by muttered curses and the scraping of boots on gravel. The leader clutched his collar, still stunned by the ease with which Frank had disarmed him. Frank watched them, his stance steady, his sharp gaze following every movement. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, not for a moment, but there was an unmistakable edge in the air, a sense that the storm wasn't quite over. As the leader mounted his bike, he paused, glaring back at Frank. "You're gonna regret this, old man," he spat. His words were venomous, but his voice betrayed him, shaky and uncertain. Frank didn't react immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and spoke with a calm that carried more weight than any shout ever could. "Before you go making threats," he said, his tone firm, "ask yourself, do you know who you're talking to?" The leader hesitated, his fingers twitching on the handlebars. "You're just some washed-up nobody," he snarled, though the words came out weaker than he intended. Frank tilted his head slightly, almost as if in pity. "Washed up? Maybe," he said. "But a nobody? Let me correct that for you." The quiet fell heavy over the gas station lot, the other bikers glancing at one another uneasily. Even the bravest among them seemed unsure of what was about to happen. Frank's calm demeanor was more unnerving than any display of anger could have been. "You ever heard of Blackridge?" Frank asked, his voice steady, his words deliberate. The mention of the name sent a ripple through the group. Blackridge. The bikers didn't need a full explanation to recognize it. It was the kind of name that lived in whispers, the kind that came with stories too dangerous to repeat in full. One of the younger bikers blurted out, "Wait, the Blackridge Op. That was, like, special forces or something, wasn't it?" The leader turned to glare at him, but Frank chuckled a low, knowing sound. "Special forces," he said, almost to himself. "That's what they called it, sure. The kind of missions they don't print in the papers, the kind no one's supposed to know about." His gaze swept over the group, sharp and unyielding. "I wasn't just on that team," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. "I led it." The leader paled, his bravado cracking further. "You're lying," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Frank stepped closer, his presence commanding the space. "You think so?" he asked. "Think about what just happened. 6 of you, 1 of me. Do I look like someone who needs to lie to prove a point?" The bikers exchanged nervous glances. Their leader, desperate to regain control, barked, "We don't care about some ancient war stories. You're just an old man now." Frank's expression didn't change. "Old? Sure," he said. "But age doesn't erase what you've done or what you're capable of doing." He gestured to the crumpled forms of their fallen comrades, who were still groaning on the ground. "You came here thinking you'd find an easy target. What you found was a ghost, someone who knows how to disappear when he needs to and reappear when you least expect it." The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the weight of Frank's words pressing down on everyone present. The leader tried one last time to save face, his voice rising with false confidence. "You think you're untouchable? There are people out there tougher than you, old man. Bigger, badder, meaner. And one day, you'll meet them." Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've already met them," he said. "And they didn't live to tell about it?" With that, he turned his back on them, walking calmly toward his truck. It was an act of complete dismissal, a statement louder than any words could have been. The leader hesitated for a moment, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he gunned his engine and sped off. The rest of the bikers followed suit, their departure loud but far less confident than their arrival. Frank leaned against the side of his truck, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The dust from the bikers' departure settled slowly, the quiet of the gas station returning like a comforting blanket. The gas station clerk peeked out from behind the counter, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Mister," he said, his voice shaky, "who are you?" Frank glanced at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he considered brushing off the question, but then he nodded slightly, as if deciding it didn't matter anymore. "Just a guy passing through," he said simply, climbing into his truck. The clerk watched as Frank's truck rumbled to life and pulled onto the highway, its tail lights glowing faintly in the fading sunlight. He stood there for a long time, trying to piece together what had just happened, the name Black Ridge echoing in his mind like a distant thunderclap. As Frank drove off, his grip on the wheel tightened ever so slightly. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble always seemed to find him. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, but today had been a harsh reminder that some things could never stay buried. But he wasn't afraid. He never had been. They can come if they want, he thought, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. They'll leave the same way the others did, empty-handed and broken. Frank Mitchell was many things: a drifter, a survivor, a man with a past too dangerous to speak of. But most importantly, he was a man you didn't mess with, because once you did, the game was over before it even began. Frank drove down the empty highway, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his mind lingering on the confrontation at the gas station. He didn't regret what he'd done. It wasn't in his nature to back down from bullies, but he knew this incident might stir up trouble he hadn't anticipated. The rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance, but Frank was no fool. He had seen men like them before, men who let pride override common sense. They'd be back. Whether it was tonight, tomorrow, or weeks from now, they wouldn't let this go. And Frank was ready. He always was. The bikers, meanwhile, regrouped at a seedy roadside bar a few miles away. The air inside was thick with smoke and the stale smell of spilled beer. They sat at a corner table, their voices low and angry, the shame of their defeat etched into every line of their faces. "That old guy," one muttered, nursing his bruised wrist, "he wasn't normal. Did you see how fast he moved? Like some damn ninja or something." "Shut up, Vince," the leader snapped, slamming his beer onto the table. His pride was still stinging from the way Frank had effortlessly disarmed him. "He's just a guy, a lucky one. Next time, we won't give him the chance." Another biker, the youngest of the group, hesitated before speaking. "You heard what he said, though, right? About Black Ridge? That's not just some random name." The table fell silent. The leader's jaw tightened, but he refused to show doubt. "I don't care what he said. Old soldiers are just that old. We'll handle him." Back at the gas station, the clerk was still trying to make sense of what had happened. He had seen plenty of tough customers come through, but none like Frank. His calmness, his precision, it wasn't normal. Curiosity got the better of him, and he pulled out his phone, typing Black Ridge Special Forces into the search bar. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The first result was an article titled "The Ghosts of Black Ridge, the Special Forces Unit That Didn't Exist." He clicked on it, skimming through descriptions of covert missions, high-risk extractions, and operations so classified that even the military denied their existence. The team had been nicknamed the Ghosts because they were invisible, untouchable, and unstoppable. One line caught his attention: led by a man known only as the Phantom, this unit was responsible for some of the most dangerous missions of the past 3 decades. The clerk's hands shook as he put the phone down. Could Frank Mitchell be the Phantom? The thought seemed ridiculous, and yet, after what he had witnessed, it wasn't hard to believe. That night, as Frank pulled into a small motel on the outskirts of a neighboring town, he felt the familiar weight of his past pressing on him. He parked his truck under a flickering streetlight, the neon motel sign buzzing faintly above. Inside his room, Frank sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small duffel bag he had tossed on the floor. From it, he pulled out a battered notebook. Its pages were filled with scribbled names, dates, and coordinates, a map of his life's most dangerous moments. One name stood out, circled in bold ink: Black Ridge. Frank ran a hand over the page, his expression unreadable. It wasn't nostalgia, it was something darker. Regret. Maybe. But there was also acceptance. The things he had done couldn't be undone, and the man he had been couldn't be erased. At the bar, the bikers had decided their next move. Fueled by liquor and wounded pride, they convinced themselves that their numbers and their weapons would be enough to take Frank down. "We'll find him," the leader growled. "And this time, we won't play games." The youngest biker hesitated, doubt flickering in his eyes. What if he really is who he says he is? What if we're messing with someone we shouldn't? The leader slammed his fist on the table. "I don't care if he's the president. No one makes us look like fools and gets away with it. You're in or you're out." The room fell silent. Finally, the younger man nodded reluctantly. Frank, unaware of their immediate plans but fully expecting their return, took quiet precautions. He checked his truck, ensuring everything was in working order. He secured his belongings, keeping only what he needed within arm's reach. Then, from a hidden compartment under the truck seat, he pulled out a small, weathered case. Inside was a handgun, its grip smooth from years of use, and a military-issued knife. Tools of a life he had hoped to leave behind but knew he never truly could. He didn't want to use them. He never did. But if they came back, he wouldn't hesitate. Hours later, in the dead of night, the bikers rolled into the motel parking lot. Their engines cut through the silence, their headlights casting long, menacing shadows. Frank heard them before he saw them. He was already awake, sitting in the dark, his senses on high alert. When the first knock came at his door, Frank didn't flinch. Instead, he stood slowly, pocketed the knife, and walked toward the sound. The leader's voice was muffled through the door. "Come on out, old man. Let's finish what we started." Frank opened the door, stepping out into the dimly lit lot. He didn't look afraid. If anything, he looked bored. "You boys really don't learn, do you?" he said, his tone almost disappointed. The leader grinned, pulling out a crowbar and pointing it at Frank. "This time, you're not walking away." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Neither are you." The next few minutes were chaos. The bikers, confident in their numbers, rushed him. But Frank moved like a shadow, slipping through their attacks with an ease that defied logic. One by one, they fell. The leader swung the crowbar, only for Frank to duck, grab his arm, and send him sprawling to the ground. Another lunged with a chain, but Frank sidestepped, his movements precise and practiced. When the dust settled, the bikers were on the ground, groaning in pain. Frank stood in the center, barely out of breath, his expression unreadable. "Let this be your last warning," he said, his voice cold. "The next time you come after me, you won't get back up." He turned and walked away, leaving them broken and humiliated under the flickering streetlight. The gas station lot was quiet again, but the air felt different. The tension that had hung in the air moments before had dissipated, leaving only a stillness that seemed almost too peaceful after the chaos that had unfolded. The roar of the motorcycles, once deafening, now faded into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the echo of what had just happened. Frank's truck, the last symbol of the chaos, rumbled as it pulled away from the scene, heading down the road toward the horizon. Inside the gas station, the young clerk remained frozen, staring out the window as the bikers slowly disappeared from view. His hands still trembled, unsure whether what he had just witnessed had been real or some sort of strange, intense dream. The image of Frank calm, collected, and completely in control stayed with him like a haunting memory. The way Frank had handled the situation, the way he had turned the tables on the bikers without breaking a sweat, had been nothing short of extraordinary. "Sir, that was incredible," the clerk finally whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. He was speaking more to himself than to Frank, but the words felt like a testament to the powerful impact Frank had left on him. Frank, for his part, didn't seem to care much for the praise. He simply shrugged and gave a small, almost indiscernible smile. "Just another day," he said, his voice calm, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his otherwise uneventful life. With that, he climbed into his truck, his every movement relaxed, as though he had done nothing more than take out the trash. The young clerk stood there, unable to shake the feeling that Frank was no ordinary man. He had seen enough of the world to recognize toughness when it was in front of him, but Frank's brand of toughness was something entirely different: quiet, controlled, and yet undeniably lethal. As Frank's truck disappeared down the road, the clerk turned back to the counter, but his mind was still processing what had happened. Could it really be true? Could the old man, someone who looked like just another dusty traveler, be someone with a past far beyond anything he could have imagined? The clerk couldn't be sure, but the fear he had seen in the eyes of the bikers said everything. No one could take on 6 bikers, all of them with their tough guy postures and attitudes, without some serious experience. And Frank? He'd handled them like they were nothing more than an inconvenience. He glanced at the corner of the parking lot where Frank had stood moments before. There was a sense of quiet authority that lingered in the air. It wasn't just the force of his actions that had commanded respect, it was the confidence with which he had done it, the complete lack of hesitation. Frank hadn't been trying to impress anyone, but that was exactly what he had done. Who was he really? The clerk muttered to himself. The day passed, and the events at the gas station slowly began to fade into the background of life for most people. The bikers had left, their bruises serving as a quiet reminder of the old man who wasn't afraid to stand up for himself. The gas station had returned to its usual rhythm, with customers stopping in for gas or snacks, unaware of what had happened only hours before. But for the clerk, things were different. He couldn't forget the way Frank had taken control, how he had stood up to the bikers without so much as blinking. And it bothered him, in the best way possible. Frank, meanwhile, continued driving down the open highway, as he had done countless times before. The road stretched out before him like a long, winding ribbon, but his mind wasn't on the miles ahead. It was on the events of the day, the bikers, their arrogance, and how quickly it had all fallen apart. He wasn't surprised by their return, they were predictable that way. Men like that always thought they could bully and intimidate people without consequences. What had surprised him, however, was how easily they had underestimated him. Frank wasn't some old man living in the past, he was someone who had lived through it all, and had the scars to prove it. His life hadn't been about trying to impress anyone or reliving his glory days. But when push came to shove, Frank could still handle himself better than any of them. As the miles passed, Frank allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He wasn't out to prove anything, but in a way, today had been a victory. The bikers had learned their lesson. They had tried to push him, and they had failed. The way they scrambled to leave, their egos shattered, was all the confirmation he needed. Back at the gas station, the clerk was finally able to catch his breath. He continued to glance out the window, watching for any signs of the bikers returning. He wasn't foolish enough to think they would come back immediately, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they found another way to challenge Frank. After all, bullies like that didn't take kindly to being humiliated. They wouldn't forget what had happened. And neither would the clerk. Later that evening, as Frank pulled into a small diner and parked under the glowing sign, he found himself thinking about the bikers again. The incident at the gas station was over, but their attitudes weren't. They were the type who believed they could walk into any situation and control it. But Frank had shown them otherwise, and that felt good. As he entered the diner and ordered a cup of coffee, the young waitress behind the counter gave him a quick, cautious glance, but she said nothing. Frank paid no mind to her nervous eyes. He wasn't concerned with drawing attention, he had never been one to seek it. But there was one thing he knew for sure. No one would mess with him again. Not the bikers, not anyone. He had served justice, and the world had learned a small but important lesson: you can't always judge a man by his age, his looks, or his silence. Because sometimes, the quietest men are the most dangerous. And as Frank sipped his coffee, watching the world pass by outside, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, things had worked out the way they were meant to. His old, quiet life had returned to normal for now. But if someone else tried to push him again, he'd be ready. The world could be a dangerous place, but for those who knew how to protect themselves, it was also a place where justice was still possible. And Frank Mitchell had made sure of that, one biker at a time. As he left the diner later that evening, the stars above were brighter than he remembered, and the night seemed a little quieter than before. But Frank knew that he would never be the kind of man who could fade into the background. He was too much of a force for that. And no one would ever forget the quiet man with the steel resolve. As Frank's truck disappeared into the dark road once more, the clerk at the gas station finally got up the courage to Google Frank's name. The search didn't take long. Within moments, the clerk found what he was looking for: Frank Mitchell. Retired Special Forces. Ghost of Black Ridge. And just like that, the pieces fell into place. The clerk didn't need to read the rest of the article to understand. He had seen enough. He had witnessed it firsthand: the power of Frank Mitchell, the man who had taken on the bikers without breaking a sweat. And suddenly, everything made sense. Frank Mitchell wasn't just another old man. He was something more. He was a legend. The clerk leaned back, staring at the screen for a moment before he muttered to himself, "Guess he's not just an ordinary guy after all." And with that, he shut off the computer, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Frank Mitchell had served justice today, and it was the kind of justice that would be remembered long after the bikers had left town. Sometimes, the ones you overlook are the ones you should fear the most. In a world that loves to judge by appearances, it's easy to make assumptions about people. We look at someone and think we know them, whether it's their age, their clothes, or how they carry themselves. But the truth is, we never truly know who someone is until we see them act. Strength doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with a loud voice, a display of power, or a flashy appearance. It waits quiet and unassuming, sitting back, observing, and learning. It watches, knowing that there will come a time when it's needed. And when that moment arrives, strength doesn't hesitate. It doesn't need to prove anything. It just acts. And by the time it strikes, it's already too late for those who underestimated it. That's exactly what Frank Mitchell had shown the world that day. To most people, he was just another man, his face weathered by age and the sun. He wasn't tall or imposing. He wasn't loud. He didn't wear a uniform or carry a weapon in plain sight. But beneath that unassuming exterior, Frank was a force to be reckoned with. In those few moments at the gas station, when the bikers thought they could bully him, they learned a lesson they would never forget. They had assumed that because he was older, quieter, and more reserved than they were, they could take advantage of him. They didn't know that behind his calm demeanor was a mind sharpened by years of training, a body hardened by experience, and a will that refused to bend in the face of intimidation. What Frank had done wasn't just about fighting back, it was about the quiet strength that had been building inside him for years. He wasn't a hero trying to save the day. He wasn't someone looking for recognition or glory. He simply saw a situation where he needed to stand his ground, and that's exactly what he did. In the end, it wasn't the bikers' aggression that won the day. It was Frank's unwavering resolve, his self-discipline, and the experience that came with years of facing challenges that most people never knew about. The bikers had been strong in numbers, loud in their insults, and confident in their belief that they could intimidate anyone. But when it came down to it, all that bravado crumbled in the face of true strength. True strength doesn't need to shout to be heard. It doesn't need to overpower or dominate. It simply needs to exist in the moment it's needed most, and when that moment comes, It's unstoppable. It's easy to overlook people who don't show their strength. It's easy to assume that the quiet ones are weak or passive, that the ones who don't seek attention are somehow less capable. But that's a mistake. Strength doesn't look the same for everyone. For some, it's a loud roar, a powerful gesture, a display of force. For others, it's calm and measured, a quiet confidence that knows when to act and when to hold back. People like Frank Mitchell don't need to tell the world who they are or what they're capable of. They don't need to boast, to draw attention to themselves, or to prove anything. They let their actions speak for them. And when the time comes, those actions have more impact than any words ever could. It's a reminder to all of us that we should never judge someone by the surface. Just because someone is quiet, unassuming, or even older, doesn't mean they don't possess an inner strength that could rival anyone. The ones who blend into the background, the ones who are often overlooked, are often the ones who have the most to offer when the world needs them. It's easy to dismiss people because they don't fit the mold of what we expect strength to look like. But strength is more than appearances. It's more than age or size. True strength is the ability to stay calm under pressure, to stand firm in the face of adversity, and to act when needed without hesitation or fear. And sometimes, the most powerful people in the world are the ones who don't need to prove anything. When Frank stood up to the bikers that day, he wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't trying to show off or make a statement. He was simply acting in the moment. He knew that if he didn't stand his ground, others might suffer the same fate. And he couldn't let that happen. That's what made his actions so powerful, the quiet resolve, the strength that was hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It's a lesson that we should all take to heart. The world is full of people who are easy to overlook, people who don't speak loudly, who don't demand attention, who don't look like heroes on the outside. But inside, they might be stronger than we can imagine. They might be the very people who can make the difference when it counts the most. So the next time you meet someone who doesn't seem to stand out, remember Frank Mitchell. Remember that strength isn't always loud. It doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It's quiet, unassuming, and often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when it's needed most. The bikers learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they were the ones in control. They thought their loudness and intimidation would win the day. But in the end, it was the quiet strength of one man that made all the difference. And when they realized their mistake, it was already too late. So, if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone underestimates you, where they think they can push you around or take advantage of you, remember this: you don't need to prove anything to anyone. True strength is not about making others afraid of you. It's about having the power to stand your ground when the time comes, and knowing that you have what it takes to handle whatever the world throws your way. Sometimes, the quiet ones are the strongest. And sometimes, when you least expect it, they will rise to the occasion, showing the world that strength is not about how loud you shout, but about how firmly you stand.